Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Has Foreign Minister Jaishankar been able to influence the Biden administration's view of the India-Canada crisis? That's a critical issue I shall bring up in the forthcoming assessment of the overall position of the American government on this matter. Joining me live from the United States is a fellow of the American Enterprise Institute and a well-known and highly regarded columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Sadanand Dhume. Sadanand Dhume, let me start with a general question. I'll come to Foreign Minister Jaishankar after that. 12 days after Prime Minister Trudeau went public with his explosive allegations, how would you assess the response of the Biden administration?
I think the Biden administration has been walking a tightrope. They very clearly have signaled that they are standing by Canada, which is America's oldest and arguably closest ally. But at the same time, they have been very careful not to directly criticize India because they recognize that India is an important part of America's Indo-Pacific strategy. So they don't want to alienate an old ally. They also don't want to alienate a new friend. And that seems to be where they are at the moment.
Now, as you know, Foreign Minister Jaishankar met with both Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Thursday. There was no readout after the Sullivan meeting, and the readout after the Blinken meeting simply said that they had discussed a whole range of issues. Was this deliberate omission of the India-Canada crisis an attempt to avoid embarrassment for New Delhi?
I don't know. I mean, I think they genuinely would have had a whole lot of things on their agenda which would have predated this explosive revelation. Obviously, nobody wants to embarrass the Indian foreign minister. And I think at this point, what is crucial to understand is that we know relatively little, at least in the public domain, in terms of hard evidence to sort of talk to definitively prove whether or not Trudeau's allegations are correct. So I think under these circumstances, it would be foolish for the State Department to sort of have this as part of the official readout. But I'm sure you did notice that there was a story later in the Associated Press that said that the issue did come up privately. And I think that gives you a sense of how this is being handled.
In fact, not just the Associated Press, shortly after the meeting with Jaishankar, Blinken at a press conference actually went public. And I want to quote what he said at that press conference. We are very concerned about the allegations that have been raised by Canada by Prime Minister Trudeau. We have been in close contact with Canada about that, and at the same time, we have engaged with the Indian government and urge them to work with Canada on an investigation. Those responsible need to be held accountable, and we hope that our friends in both Canada and India will work together to resolve this matter. Now, that is almost word to word a repetition of what both Blinken and Sullivan have said earlier as well. And this raises that key question. Has Mr. Jaishankar managed to influence the American government's stand on the India-Canada crisis, or is that not apparent at the moment?
I think their stand remains the same as it was 12 days ago. But if you look at the statement that you just read out, I think it's quite sort of striking that Blinken did not use the term alleged transnational repression, which he had used in an earlier sort of statement. So, this is sort of, I think that this is just par for the course. This is where the US is going to be, at least for now, as this investigation unfolds. Things could change. If we see different evidence, if things, it could definitely change. But for now, I think this is the line that they're trying to walk. And every single statement that you've seen, whether from Blinken or Jake Sullivan or from other spokespersons, walks exactly that line. The US is not going to abandon Canada. It is going to take Canada's concerns very seriously. It's a very important ally. It's a Five Eyes country. It's a NATO country. It's a G7 country. It's a neighbor. However, at the same time, they aren't going to sort of go all in the way Trudeau has and publicly condemn India or do things that would, overtly damage the relationship with India.
But you began your answer by saying there's been no change in the American position. What Blinken said earlier, he said effectively after meeting Jaishankar as well.
Correct. I think the American position is, in fact, what they're stating, which is that they seem to think that there is some credibility and that there should be cooperation between these two countries, both of which are friendly to the United States. So they would like to see this sort of, resolved to the degree possible in an amicable way.
Now, there's something else, Sadanand Dhume, that seems to have become pretty clear in the last 24, 36 hours. The Biden administration, and I mean both Blinken as well as the State Department spokesperson, have repeatedly said that they have urged the Indian government to work with Canada on an investigation. That clearly suggests that the Americans believe there is something to investigate. On the other hand, Mr. Jaishankar has repeatedly said, first in New York and then initially at the Hudson Institute in Washington, that India hasn't got anything specific or relevant. Doesn't that suggest that the two sides view Canada's intelligence very differently?
Well, I think that the sort of, the question really is that what exactly, and this is the part that nobody knows at this point, what exactly has Canada presented to India? If you listen to the Indian responses, the suggestion is that the Canadians have come up with misgivings, but they haven't come up with anything specific and actionable on which India can act. If you were to sort of, parse the language coming out of Washington, I think that it's generally to nudge to India towards being receptive to Canadian questions. But I think at this point, frankly, the ball is in Canada's court, partly because it's their Prime Minister who has gone public with this explosive allegation on the floor of Parliament. And he hasn't come up with solid evidence at this point. Now, you might argue that that's how intelligence works. You can't sort of put everything out in public. But then I would sort of counter and say that, well, if you don't have the goods, don't go and speak out in Parliament.
I'll come to Canada in a moment's time, but let's first drill a little deeper about what we know of America's, in quotes, involvement. The American ambassador in Canada has confirmed that one or more of the Five Eyes countries shared intelligence with Canada. The New York Times has confirmed that one of those countries was America. Additionally, the New York Times has said that Canada has what the paper calls a smoking gun, which the paper describes as intercepted communications of Indian diplomats in Canada indicating involvement in the plot. In addition, both Sullivan and Blinken have said that Washington was in constant contact with our Canadian counterparts, consulting them closely. And Blinken, in fact, went on to particularly emphasize the word coordination. Does all of that taken together suggest that America could know how good or how poor is the intelligence Canada has?
I think that's a pretty fair assessment. I think I would be very surprised if America did not know, given the closeness of the intelligence sharing relationship among the Five Eyes countries. But again, what you're seeing merely is that the Canadians have very strong suspicions. The Americans have reason to take those suspicions seriously, but the Americans are not going out and making the kind of accusations that the Canadians have made.
No, absolutely. The Americans are making no accusation at all, but the Americans are repeatedly saying, and I'm quoting Blinken, that they want India to work with Canada on an investigation. I presume that's because they have a fairly good idea of what sort of intelligence this is, and they believe it requires investigation. It can't just be pushed aside and ignored.
It could be that, but it could also be that they find themselves in a position where Canada has gone out and said something publicly, and that would be very embarrassing for the Canadians and for the Trudeau government if they did not show public support. So some of this, I don't know how they have. I have no sort of insight into how they have assessed the intelligence. This could also be a diplomatic exercise.
Now, a week ago, the Financial Times went public and reported that Biden had raised this matter directly with Prime Minister Modi at the G20 in Delhi, and the paper says expressed concern. After that, Sullivan and Blinken fairly categorically called upon India to cooperate with Canada. Blinken said that again on Friday evening after meeting Jaishankar, and earlier Sullivan even said that there could be no special exemption regardless of the country. Does that suggest that there is a certain amount of pressure from the Biden administration on India to cooperate?
A certain amount. I don't think it's a whole lot, frankly. I think that if this had not gone public, just go back and look at the G20, look at the body language of the G20, look at how the US participated in the G20, look at how the statements that came out. I'd sort of go even further and say, even in sort of private briefings after the G20 with senior officials in the Biden administration, it was very positive. So the killing occurred on June 18th. I don't think there's any evidence that the killing has, cast some huge kind of pall over the US-India relationship. It simply has not.
But you do believe there is some pressure, we don't know how much, on India to cooperate?
I think that the US feels obligated to not abandon Canada at this moment. And I think that is sort of, I'm not sure if I'd use the word pressure, but for sure that the US is going to echo some of Canada's concerns. But let's just sort of do this as a counterfactual for a moment. If Trudeau had not made his statement in Parliament, if he had not kind of precipitated this situation, do you think Blinken or Sullivan or anyone would be talking about these things? Do you think we'd have the story leaked to the FT talking about how Biden had raised this issue? My answer is probably not.
Let me now raise with you something that you may not be aware of, because it only happened in India post midday my time, which is roughly 4 hours ago. At roughly 12:30 p.m. today, PTI, that's the Press Trust of India, released a story which says that last night, talking to Indian journalists in Washington, Jaishankar said, and I'm now quoting PTI, India and Canada should talk to each other to resolve their differences over the death of a Khalistani separatist. But the larger issue of the Canadian government's permissiveness to terrorism, to extremism and violence must be flagged and addressed. Now, if PTI is correct, is this a small shift in the position Jaishankar took earlier in Washington and before that in New York? Because then he was saying there was nothing specific, nothing relevant. What are we to talk about? Now he's saying he's willing to talk, provided we also talk about Canada's permissiveness.
I don't see it that way. I think this is sort of, pretty much what their message has been from the start. If you look at his comments at the Council on Foreign Relations too, what the Indian position has been to sort of pivot and try to make this more a conversation about Canada's alleged permissiveness to various sort of terrorist groups and transnational groups, right? So the Canadians have made this allegation, and the Indians, obviously, they're sort of, they'll say they've from the start, Jaishankar has said that, well, if you have evidence, bring it to me. We're happy to talk. He's never said we're not going to talk. He said just we don't have anything from you. But the main thing that seems to be going on over here is that there's pushback by the government of India, and the government of India wants the conversation to be more about what's going on in Canada, particularly under Trudeau, and less about Canada's allegations about India.
Absolutely. But earlier, what Mr. Jaishankar was emphasizing, and actually going no further than that, was I have nothing specific, nothing relevant, so what am I to talk about? Give me something and I'll talk. Now, if PTI's report is accurate, he's saying we're willing to talk, provided it's not a single issue discussion. Canada's permissiveness is also discussed at the same time. Isn't that a small shift?
I don't know. I guess you can sort of, you could pass it very, very closely, but I don't really see it as a significant shift of any kind.
Okay, let's come to another aspect of this. You're sitting in America, you understand the American government better than us. How have they responded to India's accusation that Canada is a safe haven for terrorists, extremists, and organized crime. As you said, in Washington eyes, Canada is not just a G7 ally, it's not just a NATO ally, it's a close, trusted neighbor with close cultural contacts. So, how do they view this charge from New Delhi that Canada is a safe haven for terrorists?
I don't have a window into that, frankly, Karan, because I don't see sort of anything in their public statements that would indicate that they have any belief in that. It is possible that a lot of this conversation is going to happen just by its nature among the spooks. And you're probably going to sort of, so I have no idea whether behind closed doors in the conversations that the Indian government is having with the US government, they have been able to sort of convincingly make the case, which they're trying to make, which is that Canada has a problem because it's sort of seen, at least in India, as being overly permissive to various groups involved in various unsavory activities. I don't know whether that argument I know that the India is putting forward that argument. I don't know whether the Americans are taking it seriously or taking it with a large grain of salt.
What about what you called in your Wall Street article the half-crazed jihad launched by the Indian media against Trudeau personally? A former Indian diplomat has claimed that his departure from Delhi was delayed by 36 hours, not because the plane broke down, but because a stash of cocaine was found on board. The same diplomat has also claimed that Trudeau missed the president's dinner at the G20 because he was, and I'm quoting now, not in his senses due to drug consumption. I know Trudeau's office has actually gone to the extent of denying all of this, but how's this sort of talk on Indian television gone down in America?
The Trudeau government not only denied it, but they sort of described this, and I think rightly in this case, as an example of how disinformation works. I mean, I think, sadly, I'm in Providence right now for a discussion about the state of the media in India. And frankly, the fact that people are platformed to make these kind of clownish allegations speaks quite poorly of the Indian media. I mean, there was another show that I mentioned in my journal column, which talked about how Modi was going to break Canada in two pieces. I don't know how seriously people take it, but I do think that this, hysterical response of much of the Indian media does not reflect particularly well on the country, in my view.
Now, the American media, as well as media from the other side of the Atlantic in England, I'm talking about the Observer, the London Times, the Economist, in your case, I'm talking about the New York Times, and perhaps specifically Nicholas Kristof, they've all raised, in the context of the India-Canada crisis, questions about India. And I'm referring to two things. They've questioned the claim that the two countries are natural allies, and they've also questioned the wisdom of the White House turning an effective blind eye to India's democratic backsliding, its treatment of Muslims, its attempts to muzzle journalists and newspapers that are critical of the government. Is that sort of questioning in the media having any impact, or is it likely to have any impact on Biden, Blinken, Sullivan?
Well, this is cumulative, and as you know, this is not something new, right? I mean, this is something that has been building, ever since 2014, and with good reason. I mean, I myself have written several columns in the Wall Street Journal talking about some of the freedom of press issues, the treatment of religious minorities, particularly Muslims, and so on. And there's no question that this particular charge adds a data point for many people who see in India an alarming backsliding, democratic backsliding, and an alarming turn towards illiberalism. And there's no doubt about that this is sort of one more data point. Where I would differ from someone like Nick Kristof is that I'm not going to presume and give the Canadian government the benefit of doubt unless I see some evidence. So if the evidence comes out, and that turns out that what Trudeau said is correct and verifiable, then I certainly think this is sort of, it's going to, India's reputation is going to take quite a severe hit in the West. But if it remains just an allegation, which is it at this point, yes, there may still be some reputational effects. I mean, the publications you mentioned, the Nick Kristof column and so on. But I think this is still a little bit murky because the facts are still not clear.
Do you think that if it were to be convincingly established through intelligence, I know we'll never have clinching, indisputable proof that India did it, but if the intelligence is widely accepted by the American government as credible, Will that have an impact on how Washington and Biden in particular view Delhi? Will the strategic interests rather than the natural interests which bind the countries together take a hit?
So my view has always been that, India benefits enormously and has benefited enormously historically by being seen as a democracy. A flawed democracy, like all democracies are flawed, but nonetheless, as broadly speaking, a democracy with a liberal democratic constitution. I think that anything that dilutes that harms India. Now, the Indian view, and I think overwhelmingly in the Indian public as well, they seem to have sort of view these things in very starkly realpolitik terms, that America needs India to combat China and so on. And obviously, there's a great deal of truth to that. It's obvious that the US-India relationship is being driven first and foremost by strategic considerations. But I think it would be short-sighted to ignore the fact that there is a values component. People do care about these things. And I don't think that if it is proven that, India is involved in bumping off Canadian citizens in the suburbs of Vancouver, I don't think this is going to be taken lightly. Now, how exactly this would affect the US-India relationship, I don't think it would derail it. I think the equities are too deep. But you can see things that happen. Sometimes things happen that you don't even notice, right? Or you don't see explicitly. For example, it could, one of the things that could take a hit is intelligence cooperation behind the scenes, which has been enormously beneficial to India in terms of dealing with its own terrorism problem. Another thing that could potentially take a hit would be some of the kinds of technology transfer that India would like to see. But most important of all, I think that there's been a narrative in Washington for the last 20 years or so, which says, to put it simply, that the rise of India is good for the United States. When such things happen, I think people start raising questions whether that is really the case. And I think that could actually have very serious implications for India in the long term.
Tell me, there are multiple voices in India that actually question whether Trudeau has intelligence, leave aside evidence to back up his allegations, which is why people in India say he said nothing more for the last 12 days. The message one gets from the media abroad in the West is that it's highly unlikely a Canadian Prime Minister would speak in his own parliament and go public if he didn't have the evidence. What's your view on that? Is it at all possible that a Canadian Prime Minister would go public?
You've put your finger on the nub of the matter, right? A lot of this comes down to who do you trust? And there are several people who trust him precisely because the allegations are so serious and they've been made in such a serious manner. I'm not one of those people, right? I'm saying sort of show me the evidence. I don't believe that intelligence agencies are infallible. They have humans just like any other institution. They can make assessments that are wrong. I don't know. It's quite plausible to me that they may well turn out to be right. I'm not discounting it. But there are many explanations at this point that seem plausible to me, right? If someone were to say to me tomorrow that, look, we have evidence that this was some kind of rivalry between rival Sikh groups in Vancouver and he ended up getting that, I'm like, well, does that seem believable? Yes. If someone were to say that maybe he was taken out by a rival intelligence agency to discredit India, does that seem plausible? Yes. So at this point, for me, it's not enough simply that the Canadian Prime Minister has said it. But I do agree that for many Western publications, including The Economist and others, the fact that the Canadian Prime Minister has said it is enough for them to believe it.
This has clearly become a high-profile test for both sides. The outcome would matter hugely, both in Delhi and Ottawa. Given that, do you think we'll ever find out the truth?
We could, we don't know. We don't know what evidence they have, and we don't know what kind of evidence will be released, right? But look at other sort of high-profile cases, right? The Khashoggi murder. The Turks released a lot of detail. They had tapes, they had photos. There was an assassination that the Israelis had carried out some years ago in the UAE. Again, there was an enormous amount of detail that was released, right? You had photos of these guys entering an elevator and so on. So I do think that if the evidence is out there and the Canadians release it, we may not know every single detail, but it's possible that we'll have a much clearer picture in the coming months than we have today.
Two last questions. If it were to emerge, and I'll underline that word, if it were to emerge that India had done it, would the Biden administration and perhaps even the American media say that, look, this is the sort of thing countries like America and Israel have done, why on earth shouldn't India do it too? Would that temper the initial disappointment or anger?
I don't think that's how they're going to view it, right? And I think the way they're going to view it is that India has done, if it is proven, of course, that India has done something that typically democracies do not do. I don't think they view a killing of a terrorist in the Badlands of Waziristan quite the same as killing somebody in the suburbs of Vancouver. And I think the argument behind that is that if you assume that Canada is a nation which follows rule of law, that has processes in place and so on, and has friendly relations with India, normal diplomatic and legal processes should be used and should suffice. This is the sort of thing that governments resort to only in places where those normal means are not available. So I think that would be the argument. I don't think there'd be a lot of sympathy for India if it is proven.
Let me put this to you, because this is a view that's often canvassed in Delhi. After the Munich Olympics of 1972, Mossad took out alleged terrorists in Paris and Rome. Those were two European cities where they were taken out. America in the 70s, through the CIA, overthrew Allende, who was a properly democratically elected president. And then there was Grenada, if I recall, several years later as well. None of that was held against either Israel or America. Can't those same values, or that same treatment at least, apply to India if it is shown that India was guilty?
So there are two parts to this, right? The one is, why would America judge India differently from how it judges itself? And you could make the case that America would be hypocritical to judge India as it, different. But the fact is that countries are going to judge these things through their own lenses and through their own interests. Is it in the interest of the United States for Canada to become a country where foreign intelligence agents can, with impunity, kill Canadians? It is not in the interest of the United States, and the United States will stand up for that interest. It is completely in the interest of the United States for the Canadians to continue to trust its alliance with the United States. And what's implicit in that alliance with the United States is a security umbrella. So if Canada begins to feel insecure, that is not in the interest of the Canadians, but it is also not in the interest of the United States. And so the US is going to act in its self-interest. It's not going to sort of act out of some kind of abstract argument about whether this is fair or not fair. That's the first point. The second, Munich and so on, it was a different world. We're talking about stuff that happened 50 years ago. And the Israelis since then have, I can't think of any recent Israeli hit on a Palestinian or elsewhere in France or in Germany or in Canada or in the United States. So I think there is a difference between what was going on in the 1970s. I'm not sure how many of the people, there was an incident in Norway, for instance, where I think a Norwegian citizen may have died. It's not clear to me what the citizenship of the people who were killed following the Munich massacre was, but it was also a different world. And I don't think that it necessarily makes sense to believe that the United States will simply say that, well, this is something that the Israelis did 50 years ago, so it's fine if the Indians do it now.
I take it that the first half of your answer about Canada and America is the background against which Sullivan said there can be no special exemption regardless of which country it is.
I think so, yes.
My last question, Sadanand Dhume, in these circumstances, and particularly if the lack of clarity continues, do you think President Biden will accept Prime Minister Modi's invitation to be chief guest on Republic Day?
I don't. I think a lot of that depends on what is public. I think it's a very, very interesting and very delicately poised. Usually when an ambassador mentions that the invitation has gone out, it usually implies that it's been accepted, right? Because when you put it out in public, then it means that India can't invite anyone else and so on. But it'll be interesting to watch, and I think that's going to be one indicator of what effect this has had on India-US relations would be, whether Biden accepts it or not. If he does accept the relationship, then the invitation, then without a doubt, this has just been a blip that passes.
And if he doesn't, then it'll be a bigger concern.
Well, he could also not do it for other reasons, right? We don't know. He may have health issues and so on. This is coming. He has an election coming up. So I don't want to read too much into it. But if he does come, then clearly it shows that this didn't matter.
Sadanand Dhume, thank you very much for making time for us.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.